Your story is not over. Look at me. The words ripped from Kellen Grayson's throat, raw and urgent, cutting through the scream of twisting metal and the acrid smell of burning rubber. He gripped the woman's shoulders through the shattered driver's side window, his knuckles scraping against jagged glass. Her eyes, a startling, piercing blue, were wide with shock, unfocused, staring at something far beyond the wreckage. You fight for whatever comes next. You fight! From the curb, a small, clear voice sliced through the chaos. You're my hero, Dad. Wren. For a fraction of a second, Kellen's focus split. His daughter stood on the sidewalk, her small hands clutching the straps of her unicorn backpack, her face a mask of terror and awe. He'd been driving her to school, the crisp new shirt he'd bought for his interview already feeling tight around his neck with nerves. They were going to be early. He'd planned it perfectly. A quick drop-off, a final review of his notes in the car, and then the interview that might finally lift them out of the endless cycle of rent-due notices and night shifts. Then, the screech of tires, the sickening crunch. A sleek, black sedan spun out and slammed into a concrete traffic barrier, its front end crumpling like a discarded piece of paper. Flames began to lick at the edges of the hood. Now, his plans were ash. The interview, the quiet moment of preparation, all of it incinerated in the heat rolling off the wreck. The woman in the driver's seat just stared blankly, a single, perfect cut bleeding a line down her temple. She wore a tailored suit, the kind of fabric that cost more than Kellen's monthly grocery bill. Please, just go, she whispered, the words barely audible. It's going to... Not without you, he grunted, pulling at the jammed door. The metal groaned but didn't budge. Smoke, thick and black, poured from under the hood. The other drivers on the road had stopped, but no one was moving closer. Phones were out, small black rectangles held up like shields, capturing the disaster from a safe distance. Kellen abandoned the door and reached back through the window. Unbuckle your belt. She didn't move. He leaned further in, the heat scorching his face, fumbling for the release buckle. It clicked free. Okay, now you have to help me. I'm going to pull. You push with your feet. Can you do that? His voice, steady and commanding, seemed to finally penetrate her shock. She blinked, her gaze slowly focusing on his face. She nodded, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. Good. On 3, he commanded, wrapping his arms around her torso, ignoring the sharp pain as a shard of glass dug into his forearm. 1, 2, 3! He heaved backward with everything he had, a lifetime of lifting, carrying, and fixing coiled into one desperate motion. She pushed, a weak but determined effort. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then, with a final, wrenching tear of metal and fabric, she came free. He stumbled back, pulling her with him, their bodies collapsing onto the asphalt just as a loud whoosh erupted from the car. The flames surged, engulfing the cabin in a wave of orange and black. Kellen scrambled away, dragging the woman with him until they were a safe distance away. He helped her sit up, her body trembling. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Are you okay? Are you hurt anywhere else? He asked, his own breath coming in ragged gasps. She just stared at the burning car, her hand coming up to touch the cut on her temple, as if just realizing it was there. You saved me. Anyone would have, he said, though he knew it wasn't true. He'd seen the faces in the other cars, the passive observers. He glanced back at Wren, who was now being shielded by a woman who'd gotten out of her minivan. Wren's eyes were locked on him, shining with a fierce pride that made his chest ache. Paramedics swarmed the scene. They descended on the woman, wrapping her in a blanket, checking her pupils, speaking in calm, professional tones. Kellen stood up, brushing himself off. His new shirt was torn and smeared with soot. A deep gash on his arm was bleeding freely. The interview was at 9. It was 8:47. There was no way. As the paramedics guided the woman toward the ambulance, she looked back at him, her expression a mixture of confusion and gratitude. "Wait, who are you? Your uniform. Are you a firefighter?" He looked down at his ruined clothes. "Number, I'm just a guy who was passing by." Before she could ask another question, they had her in the ambulance. He watched the doors close, the sirens blare, and the vehicle pull away, disappearing into the flow of traffic. The one shot he'd had at a different life was gone, traded for a stranger's. He walked back to the curb where Wren was waiting, her face pale. She threw her arms around his waist. "You were so brave, Dad." He hugged her tight, burying his face in her hair. "You okay, kiddo?" "I was scared," she admitted in a small voice. "But I knew you'd save her." He looked down at his torn sleeve, the blood now soaking through the fabric. He'd have to get it cleaned, stitched up. The cost of it flickered through his mind, another unexpected expense on a pile of them. The missed interview felt like a phantom limb, an ache for something he'd almost had. "Come on," he said, forcing a smile. "Let's get you to school. You're going to be late." "What about your job interview?" she asked, looking up at him with worried eyes. He squeezed her shoulder, the lie tasting like ash in his mouth. "We'll reschedule." He knew he wouldn't. Jobs like that, head of maintenance at a top-tier tech firm, with benefits, with a real future, didn't come around twice. You got one shot, and his had just gone up in smoke on the side of the freeway. As they walked back to his beat-up sedan, parked a block away from the wreckage, he didn't know that the videos were already spreading. Uploaded from a dozen different angles, tagged with number sign Freeway Hero and number sign Burning Car Rescue. He didn't know that in a hospital room across the city, the woman with the piercing blue eyes was asking everyone who would listen if they'd found the man who pulled her from the fire. And he certainly didn't know that her name was Thea Caldwell, and the job he had just missed was at her company. All he knew was the familiar weight of disappointment and the small, warm hand of his daughter, holding on to his as if he were the strongest man in the world. 2 days later, the name Thea Caldwell meant nothing to Kellen Grayson. It was just a name printed on the letterhead of the overdue notices that seemed to breed on his kitchen counter. He worked for Caldwell Logistics, but only in the way a barnacle works for a whale, a tiny, insignificant organism clinging to the underside of a giant. He pushed a broom through its cavernous warehouses on the night shift, and a check with its logo appeared in his bank account every other Friday. The whale never noticed the barnacle. His apartment was quiet except for the hum of the old refrigerator and the scratching of Wren's colored pencils at the kitchen table. He sat under the single bare bulb, carefully pulling a needle and thread through the gash on his forearm. A doctor's visit was $100 he didn't have. A bottle of antiseptic and a sewing kit from the dollar store was $5. The math was simple. Brutal. "Does it hurt?" Wren asked without looking up from her drawing. "Only when I think about it," he said, tying off the last stitch with a grimace. She pushed her masterpiece across the table. It was a drawing of him, rendered in bold crayon strokes. He was wearing a cape and flying through the air, pulling a stick figure woman from a car shaped like a red scribble of fire. "This is for your new office," she said matter-of-factly. His chest tightened. "What new office, kiddo?" "The one you're going to get. After you rescheduled your interview," she said, her faith as bright and absolute as the yellow crayon sun she'd drawn in the corner. He didn't have the heart to tell her that when he'd called to explain, the HR woman's voice had been cold and final. The position was filled. He was just a no-show, an unreliable candidate. An act of heroism didn't fit on a resume. He taped the drawing to the refrigerator door, next to a final demand from the electric company. "It's the best one yet," he said, his voice thick. Across the city, in a penthouse office that seemed to float in the sky, Thea Caldwell watched the same act of heroism for the 10th time. The video, shaky and pixelated, played on a massive screen that took up an entire wall. Your story is not over. Look at me." The voice on the recording was distorted, but the raw power of it hit her every time. It was the only thing that had cut through the fog of the crash. She'd spent her life building an empire on the principle that emotion was a liability. You didn't feel, you calculated. You didn't hope, you executed. Then this man, this stranger with soot on his face and desperation in his eyes, had commanded her to fight. "Anything?" she asked, not taking her eyes off the screen. Her assistant, a young, perpetually nervous man named Ben, shook his head. "We've been running facial recognition against every database we can access. Nothing. The police have no record of him. It's like he's a ghost." "A ghost saved my life, Ben," she snapped, the edge in her voice making him flinch. "Find him." Her phone buzzed. A conference call. She stabbed the accept button, her face instantly hardening into a mask of corporate steel. "Parrish." Report Leland Parrish's voice, smooth and confident, filled the room. "Morning, Thea. The diagnostics are in. The issue with the Apex prototype is a minor software bug. The engineers are deploying a patch as we speak. We'll be ready for the demonstration next week. No need to worry." Thea leaned forward, the cut on her temple a dull throb. "A minor bug that caused the primary sorting arm to drop a 200-pound container yesterday, Leland? That's not a bug. That's a lawsuit waiting to happen. An anomaly. The system is 99% effective," he purred. "We focus on the 99. "The 1% is what bankrupts companies," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "Fix it. And I mean actually fix it, not just patch it and pray." She ended the call and swiveled her chair to face the window. The city sprawled below her, a kingdom of glass and steel she had conquered. So why did she feel like the woman in the burning car, trapped and waiting for something to give? The man's words echoed in her head. "You fight for whatever comes next." She was fighting. But for the first time, she wasn't sure she was winning. That night, the Apex prototype was the only thing making noise in the echoing silence of Warehouse 3. Kellen was on his usual route, sweeping the perimeter. In the center of the floor, the massive machine sat under harsh industrial lights, a $10 million collection of conveyor belts, laser scanners, and robotic arms. It was supposed to be the future of logistics. From his vantage point, Kellen could see it was just a disaster on hold. He watched as two overnight engineers ran a test sequence. The machine whirred to life, arms moving with hypnotic speed. It was beautiful, complex, and deeply flawed. He saw it instantly. It wasn't the software. It was the housing on the main pivot joint of the primary sorting arm. A vibration, so tiny you wouldn't notice it unless you knew what to look for. But with every movement, the vibration was getting worse, wearing down the housing, throwing the arm's calibration off by a fraction of a millimeter. Today, a dropped container. Tomorrow, a snapped arm flying across the warehouse floor. The engineers didn't see it. They were staring at their laptops, typing code, looking for ghosts in the machine. They never thought to look at the machine itself. Kellen kept sweeping. It wasn't his problem. He wasn't an engineer. He was the guy who cleaned up their coffee spills. He had his own problems, his own life to keep from falling apart. He pushed his cart past the prototype, the rhythmic thump-thump of a loose wheel on his cart, echoing the flawed heartbeat of the machine. The next morning, Thea was staring at a fresh set of failure reports when Ben burst into her office, his face flushed with excitement. "We found him," he said, breathless. Thea shot to her feet. "What?" "The shirt he was wearing. It had a tiny logo embroidered on the pocket, barely visible. We enhanced the clearest frame. It's from a temp agency, one that provides service staff." Thea's mind raced. Service staff, janitors, security, maintenance. "We got a list of their active employees," Ben continued, swiping on his tablet. "We ran it against the facial recognition data from the video. We have a 98% match. His name is Kellen Grayson." Thea felt a jolt, a current of pure, unadulterated victory. "Where is he? Where does he work?" Ben swallowed, his excitement suddenly tempered by nervousness. He looked at the tablet, then back at her. That's the thing, Ms. Caldwell, he said slowly. According to the agency, for the last 6 months, he's been assigned to us. For a long moment, Thea Caldwell didn't speak. She just stared at the employee file displayed on the wall screen. Name: Grayson, Kellen J. Position: Janitorial Services, night shift. Status: active, the man from the fire, the hero from the videos, the ghost who had occupied her every waking thought for 2 days. He worked for her, he cleaned her buildings. The sheer, impossible irony of it was staggering. It felt like a joke played by the universe at her expense. Ms. Caldwell? Ben asked, hovering by the door. Should I do something? Thea's gaze snapped from the screen to her assistant. Her mind, usually a whirlwind of calculations and strategies, was suddenly crystal clear, focused on a single objective. She had built her empire by acting decisively, by overwhelming problems with disproportionate force. This would be no different. Get the helicopter ready, she said, her voice devoid of any emotion. Ben blinked. The helicopter, ma'am. Did I stutter? She stood up, walking to the window and looking down at the city. From this height, all the streets and neighborhoods blurred into a single, abstract map. Somewhere down there, in a world she never saw, was the man who had saved her life. Find the largest, safest landing zone near this address, she pointed to the screen without looking back. A park? A schoolyard? I don't care. And have a check drawn up from my personal account. 7 figures. 7. Ben swallowed hard. Yes, ma'am. Of course. I'm not sending him a thank you card, Ben, Thea said, more to herself than to him. I'm changing his life. Saturday morning sunlight streamed into Kellen's small patch of front yard. The air smelled like cut grass and exhaust fumes, the normal perfume of his neighborhood. He was crouched on the concrete steps, patiently guiding Wren's small fingers as they worked the chain back onto the sprocket of her bike. You see, he said softly, you just have to line up the teeth. Don't force it. It's greasy, she complained, wiping her hands on her jeans. Everything worth fixing is a little messy, he replied, giving the pedal a final turn. The chain caught and spun smoothly. There, good as new. She beamed at him. That 1,000-watt smile that always made the frayed edges of his world feel whole again. It was a good morning. A rare, peaceful Saturday with no leaky faucets to fix, no overtime shifts to chase. For a few hours, he could just be a dad. The sound started then, a low, distant chopping. Kellen didn't think anything of it at first. A news chopper, maybe. But the sound grew steadily louder, deeper, until it was a physical presence, a rhythmic thumping that vibrated in his chest. Wren looked up at the sky, her eyes wide. What's that? Down the street, kids stopped their games. People started emerging from their houses, shielding their eyes and staring at the sky. The sound was deafening now, a roaring pulse that drowned out every other noise. Then it appeared, descending from the clear blue sky like some predatory bird. A helicopter, sleek, black, with the familiar sharp-angled C logo of Caldwell Logistics emblazoned on its side. It wasn't heading for downtown. It was heading for them. Dad? Wren's voice was a mix of fear and wonder. Kellen pulled her close, his body instinctively shielding hers as the helicopter began its descent toward the small, patchy park at the end of their block. The rotor wash hit them like a hurricane, blasting dust and leaves in every direction, whipping his hair across his face. He held Wren tight, his heart pounding a rhythm that matched the beat of the blades. This didn't happen in his neighborhood. Machines like that belonged to the world on the other side of the freeway, the one with skylines and penthouses. The helicopter settled onto the grass with impossible grace. The roar softened to a whine. The side door slid open, and she stepped out. The woman from the fire. She wasn't wearing a blood-stained suit now. She was dressed in sharp, dark trousers and a silk blouse, her hair pulled back severely, the cut on her temple covered by a discreet bandage. She looked powerful, untouchable. like she was carved from different stone than everyone else on this street. Her piercing blue eyes scanned the small crowd of bewildered neighbors until they found him. She started walking toward him, her heels sinking slightly into the soft turf of the park. The crowd parted for her as if by an invisible force. She stopped a few feet away from his front steps. "Kellen Grayson?" she asked. Her voice was exactly as he remembered, crisp, commanding. He could only nod, his throat suddenly dry. Wren peeked out from behind his legs. "It's the lady from the burning car," she whispered loudly. Thea's gaze softened for a barest fraction of a second as she looked at Wren, but her attention returned to Kellen. She extended her hand. In it was a thick, cream-colored envelope. "I believe this belongs to you," she said. "My name is Thea Caldwell. You saved my life. This is a token of my gratitude. It's enough that you and your daughter will never have to worry about anything again." The whole street was silent, watching. Kellen looked at the envelope, then back at her face. He could see the certainty in her eyes, the supreme confidence of someone who believed any problem could be solved by writing a check. He thought of the interview he'd missed, the hole in his finances, the drawing on his fridge. He thought of his daughter's proud eyes. He gently shook his head. "I can't accept that, ma'am," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Thea's composure finally cracked. A flicker of disbelief crossed her face. "I'm sorry." "I didn't do it for money," he explained simply. "I did it because it was the right thing to do. I'm glad you're okay. That's all the reward I need." A murmur went through the crowd of neighbors. Thea stared at him, truly speechless for the first time in her adult life. This response wasn't in any of her calculations. People didn't just turn down millions of dollars. It wasn't logical. Before she could formulate a reply, her phone buzzed with a sharp, insistent vibration. She ignored it. "Mr. Grayson," she started, trying to find her footing. "I don't think you understand." The phone buzzed again, more urgently this time. With a flash of irritation, she pulled it from her pocket and glanced at the screen. The name Leland Parrish was flashing, along with a text message in all caps. "Clients are here." Demo moved up. "Happening now." Her expression shifted instantly. The shocked benefactor vanished, replaced by the ruthless CEO. The crisis she had put on hold had just crashed back into her reality. She looked from her phone to Kellen, 100 questions warring in her eyes. There was no time. "I have to go," she said abruptly. The words were clipped, all business. Without another word, she turned her back on him and strode back toward the waiting helicopter. The door slid shut, the rotors spun back to a deafening roar, and the great black machine lifted off the ground. It climbed into the sky and banked toward the city, leaving Kellen, Wren, and the entire neighborhood standing in a cloud of dust and stunned silence, the thick envelope still in Thea Caldwell's hand. The flight back to the city was a blur of noise and motion that Thea barely registered. She stared unseeing at the sprawling metropolis below, her mind stuck in a quiet, working-class street, replaying a conversation that defied all logic. He had said no. No one said no to Thea Caldwell. More importantly, no one said no to $2 million. It was a statistical impossibility. She had built her life on a single, unwavering principle. Every person, every action, every object had a quantifiable value. You just had to find the number. Kellen Grayson had no number. He was an anomaly, a variable she couldn't account for, and it infuriated and fascinated her in equal measure. The helicopter landed on the roof of the Caldwell Logistics Tower with a jolt that snapped her back to the present. Ben was waiting, holding the door open. "They're in Warehouse 3, he said, practically running to keep up with her stride. "Mr. Parrish started the preliminary introductions. He's stalling." "He's sweating," Thea corrected, her voice like ice as they stepped into the private elevator. "There's a difference." The doors opened directly into the vast, echoing space of the warehouse. A small, tense group was gathered in the center of the floor around the silent Apex prototype. She recognized the clients immediately. Mr. Garrick, a notoriously tough negotiator with a face like a clenched fist, and his two technical analysts. Leland Parrish stood beside them, smiling a wide, artificial smile that didn't reach his eyes. When he saw Thea, his relief was palpable. "Thea, perfect timing," he boomed, gesturing to the machine. "We were just about to begin the final demonstration." Thea ignored him. Her focus was entirely on Garrick. "Thank you for your patience, Mr. Garrick. We had a few last-minute calibrations to ensure optimal performance." Garrick gave a curt nod, his expression unreadable. "I hope so, Ms. Caldwell. My company doesn't invest in potential. We invest in results. Show me results." The air crackled with tension. This was it. The culmination of 2 years of work and $100 million of investment, all riding on this single moment. "Begin the sequence, Leland," Thea ordered. Leland tapped a command into a tablet. For a moment, nothing happened. A bead of sweat trickled down his temple. Then, with a near-silent hum, the Apex prototype whirred to life. A container slid onto the conveyor belt. The laser scanners bathed it in red light, and the primary sorting arm, the source of all their failures, swooped down, gripped the container, and placed it on the correct outbound pallet with flawless, fluid precision. It repeated the process again and again, perfectly. A collective, unconscious sigh of relief went through Thea's team. Leland's smile became genuine. "As you can see," he said, his voice oozing confidence, 100% efficiency. "My team worked through the night to perfect the—" "One moment," Garrick cut in, stepping forward. He pointed to the main pivot joint on the sorting arm. "What's this?" Everyone's eyes followed his finger. There, on the joint housing, was a small, cleverly braced metal plate, held securely in place by a tightly wound coil of industrial-grade wire. It was a simple, practical, and undeniably improvised piece of work. It was the only part of the multi-million-dollar machine that didn't gleam with a factory finish. Leland didn't miss a beat. "Ah, a brilliant question," he said smoothly. "That is a proprietary hardware reinforcement, a last-minute innovation by my engineering team to dramatically increase joint stability under high-stress loads, a testament to their outside-the-box thinking." Thea stared at the fix. It was elegant in its simplicity. It was also clearly not the work of her software engineers, who wouldn't know which end of a wrench to hold. Her mind flashed back an hour, to a man with grease on his hands, patiently fixing a child's bicycle chain. A man who refused a fortune because doing the right thing was enough. A man of quiet, practical competence. An anomaly. Leland's explanation was logical, plausible, and every instinct in Thea's body screamed that it was a lie. "Ben," she said, her voice cutting through Leland's self-congratulatory speech, "pull up the security feed for this sector. Grid 7, the last 12 hours. Leland's smile faltered. "Thea, I don't think that's necessary." "Now, Ben," she repeated, her eyes locked on Leland. Ben, fumbling with his tablet, mirrored the feed to the large monitor on the warehouse wall. The room watched in silence as he fast-forwarded through the footage. He sped past the evening shift leaving, past the engineers arguing and then departing in frustration around 3 a.m. The warehouse was empty. Then, a figure appeared on the screen. A man in a gray janitor's uniform, pushing a cleaning cart. He stopped near the Apex prototype. He didn't clean. He just stood there, watching it, his head tilted in concentration. It was Kellen Grayson. On the screen, Kellen walked over to the machine. He placed a hand on the pivot joint housing, closing his eyes as if listening to it. He looked around the empty warehouse, then reached into his cart and pulled out a small metal plate, a discarded piece of scrap, and a coil of wire. With the calm, efficient movements of a master craftsman, he fashioned the brace and secured it to the housing, tightening the wire with a distinctive, interlocking knot. He tested the arm's movement by hand, gave a small, satisfied nod, and then picked up his broom and continued his rounds, disappearing off-screen. The warehouse was utterly silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the perfectly functioning machine. Mr. Garrick slowly turned his head from the screen to Leland Parrish, whose face had gone chalk white. He then looked at Thea, a newfound respect dawning in his eyes. "Ms. Caldwell," Garrick said, a slow smile spreading across his face, "it seems your company's talent runs deeper than you let on. Let's talk numbers." Thea didn't even look at him. Her gaze was fixed on Leland Parrish, and the ice in her eyes was cold enough to burn. Thea didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. The silence in the warehouse was a weapon, and she wielded it with surgical precision. Her eyes remained locked on Leland Parrish, who seemed to shrink inside his expensive suit. "Get out," she said. The two words were quiet, but they echoed in the cavernous space like a gunshot. Leland's face, which had been pale, now flushed a blotchy red. "Thea, listen. It was a high-pressure situation. I was simply articulating the value my team brings." "Your team didn't do that," Thea said, gesturing to the security footage still frozen on the monitor. The image of Kellen Grayson, Janitor, calmly saving their collective future. "He did. The man you and your Ivy League engineers overlooked. The man you would have let take the fall if this machine had failed. You didn't just lie to a client, Leland. You lied to me. You are the 1% liability I can no longer afford. Security will escort you from the building. Your access has already been revoked." She turned her back on him before he could respond, a final, brutal dismissal. Her attention shifted to Mr. Garrick, who was watching the entire exchange with a look of shrewd appraisal. "My apologies for the internal housekeeping, Mr. Garrick," Thea said. Garrick chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "Don't apologize, Ms. Caldwell. That was the most impressive part of the demonstration. Any company can build a machine. It takes a leader to build a culture of integrity. We have a deal." He extended his hand. "Send the contract over, and when you do, give my compliments to Mr. Grayson." As they shook hands, Thea felt a sense of victory, but it was hollow. The contract was won, the traitor was vanquished, but the real issue remained. The ghost from the fire now had a name and a face, and his shadow loomed over her entire company. She turned to Ben. "Find Kellen Grayson. I need to see him, now." Ben looked down at his tablet, his brow furrowed. "That's a problem, Miss Caldwell. According to his file, Saturday is his scheduled day off. He's not on company property." Of course he wasn't. He was at home, or on his front stoop, fixing a bicycle, living in a world where integrity wasn't a corporate buzzword, but just how you lived. The thought of descending on him again in a helicopter felt obscene. That was a gesture for a nameless hero. This required something else entirely. "Get me the keys to one of the fleet cars," she said. "A standard sedan. Nothing fancy." Ben's eyes widened. "You're going to drive yourself?" "It seems," Thea said, a strange, unfamiliar emotion working its way through her, "that it's time I learned to find my own way." The park at the end of Kellen's Street was mostly empty, the afternoon sun casting long shadows on the grass. Wren was on the swings, pumping her legs furiously, trying to touch the sky. Kellen sat on a nearby bench, watching her, a small smile on his face. The bizarre events of the morning already felt like a strange dream. The helicopter, the woman, the envelope full of money he hadn't even looked at. It was easier to believe it hadn't happened. "Dad!" Wren called out, slowing her swing. "Is the helicopter lady going to come back?" "I don't think so, kiddo," he said. "She's from a different world." "You should visit her world," Wren said confidently. "You could fix all their stuff." He chuckled, but there was a sad edge to it. He'd tried to enter that world once. He'd had a scholarship to a good engineering school, his mind buzzing with ideas and designs. But his father had gotten sick, his mother couldn't cope, and he'd dropped out to work and take care of his family. By the time he was free, the opportunity was gone. He was just a guy with a GED and a knack for mechanics. That world didn't have a place for him. He was so lost in the thought that he didn't notice the quiet sedan pull up to the curb, or the woman who got out, until she was standing in front of his bench. It was her, Thea Caldwell. This time she wasn't flanked by assistants or rotor blades. She was just a woman in a simple dress, looking profoundly out of place and entirely determined. "Mr. Grayson," she said. Her voice was different now, softer, less certain. Kellen stood up slowly. "Ms. Caldwell." Wren jumped off the swing and ran over, hiding behind Kellen's legs but peeking around with curiosity. Thea knelt down slightly to meet Wren's gaze. "Hello, Wren. Your father is a remarkable man." She looked back up at Kellen. "I came here to apologize." He frowned. "For what? You don't owe me anything." "I apologize for not seeing you," she said, and the sincerity in her voice was unmistakable. "I saw a janitor. I saw a hero from a video. I saw a puzzle I couldn't solve. I never actually saw the person standing in front of me." She took a breath and explained everything that had happened at the warehouse after she'd left. The demonstration, Leland's lie, the security footage. "You didn't just save my life, Kellen," she finished, using his first name for the first time. "You saved my company, the most important thing I've ever built. And you did it with a piece of scrap metal and a coil of wire while my $1 million engineering department was chasing ghosts." He was speechless, staring at her as the weight of her words settled on him. "This morning, I offered you a reward," she continued. "I was wrong. You can't put a price on what you did. But I can offer you a position, a real one. I want you to work for me, not as a janitor. I want you on my research and development team." Kellen felt the world tilt. "R&D? Ma'am, I don't have a degree. I never even finished college." "I have dozens of people with degrees," she countered, her passion returning. "They follow the rules. They do what the textbooks say. I need someone who sees the things they don't. I need someone who understands how things actually work. I need the man who fixed the apex." He shook his head, the old insecurities rising up like a wall. "I'm not qualified." "Dad, yes you are," Wren piped up, tired of being silent. She tugged a worn, spiral-bound notebook from her backpack and thrust it at Thea. "Look." Thea took the notebook, her brow furrowed in confusion. She opened it. The pages were filled with intricate, detailed drawings, not crayon sketches of heroes, but technical designs. A more efficient gear system for a bicycle, a design for a self-watering planter made from recycled bottles, a complex schematic for a small, wind-powered generator. Each drawing was annotated with precise, handwritten notes. They were brilliant. Thea looked up from the notebook, her eyes wide with astonishment, first at Kellen, then at Wren. "He has a whole box of these at home," Wren said proudly. "He's not a janitor, he's an inventor." Thea looked at Kellen, holding the notebook as if it were a sacred text. The offer hung in the air between them. No longer just a job, but a question. It was a question about who he was, and who he was willing to become. The world that had shut its doors on him long ago was now holding one wide open, asking him to step inside. All he had to do was find the courage to walk through it. For a long time, Kellen just stood there, caught between his daughter's fierce, unwavering belief and the impossible reality of Thea Caldwell holding his secret life in her hands. The notebook contained years of quiet frustration, of brilliant ideas with nowhere to go, sketched out in the lonely hours after his shift. To see them exposed in the broad daylight felt like having his soul read aloud. I don't know what to say," he finally managed, the words feeling heavy and inadequate. Thea closed the notebook gently and handed it back to him as if it were precious. Her eyes, which had been full of surprise, were now settled into a calm, resolute certainty. "You don't have to say anything," she said. "Your work already has. The R&D lab is on the 45th floor. Orientation is Monday at 9 a.m. My assistant will send you the details. There will be an advance in your account by the end of the day for whatever you need to get started." She understood he couldn't walk into her world in his current clothes. He looked down at his worn jeans, at his hands with their calluses and faint scars. "People like me don't work on the 45th floor, Miss Caldwell. You do now," she said simply. Then she smiled, a real unguarded smile that changed her entire face. "And please, call me Thea." Monday morning felt like a dream. Kellen stood in front of the gleaming glass tower of Caldwell Logistics, a place he had entered through the rear service bay hundreds of times. Today, he was walking through the front door. He wore a new button-down shirt that felt stiff and foreign, and carried a leather satchel instead of a mop bucket. He took the elevator up, each number that lit up feeling like another step into a thinner atmosphere. When the doors opened on the 45th floor, he stepped out into a world of controlled chaos. Whiteboards were covered in complex equations, 3D printers hummed in glass enclosures, and groups of young, bright-eyed engineers were huddled over laptops, speaking a language of code and algorithms he didn't understand. He felt like an imposter, a janitor in a cheap costume. A few of the engineers glanced up as he entered, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and faint recognition. He was the man from the security footage, the janitor. Before he could retreat, Thea emerged from a glass-walled conference room. "Kellen, welcome," she said, her voice warm and professional. She turned to the rest of the lab, her voice carrying easily. "Everyone, listen up. This is Kellen Grayson, our newest innovation specialist." A ripple of murmurs went through the room. Innovation specialist was a vague but important-sounding title. Kellen has a unique, hands-on perspective that our team has been sorely lacking, Thea continued, her eyes briefly flicking toward the corner where the engineers who'd worked on the Apex were gathered. "He sees the machine, not just the code behind it. I expect you all to extend him every courtesy and resource." It was a masterful move, framing him not as a curiosity, but as a vital asset. She was giving him armor. She led him to an empty workstation near a large window overlooking the city. "This is yours," she said. "The official offer is on your new terminal. Read it over, but first—" She guided him to the center of the lab, where a small, complicated-looking drone sat on a workbench, its casing open. "This is the Sparrow," she said. "A delivery drone for dense urban environments. It's fast, agile, but it has a problem. After about 20 minutes of flight, it overheats. The thermal sensors get scrambled, and it loses navigational stability. We've tried a dozen software patches. We've redesigned the ventilation systems twice. Nothing works. My engineers think it's a processor bottleneck." She picked up a tablet showing a dizzying array of thermal imaging data and complex schematics. "Take a look. See what you see." Kellen looked at the tablet, and his heart sank. The numbers and graphs meant nothing to him. The engineers began to talk, using terms like computational fluid dynamics and heat sink efficiency. He felt a familiar wave of inadequacy wash over him. He was a fraud. He didn't belong here. He turned his attention from the tablet to the drone itself. He walked around the workbench, his eyes tracing the physical lines of the machine. He ran a hand gently over its carbon fiber shell. He peered into the open casing, at the tightly packed array of wires and circuit boards. He ignored the data and looked at the thing itself. And then he saw it. It was a small bundle of wires, wrapped tightly and secured with a plastic zip tie, right next to the primary motor. It was neat, efficient, exactly how the assembly manual instructed. But he could see in his mind's eye how the heat from the motor would radiate, how it would get trapped in that dense bundle of wiring, and how that trapped heat would then travel directly to the thermal sensor located just a centimeter away. "The problem isn't the processor," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the engineer's debate. Everyone turned to look at him. "The heat isn't coming from the chip," he continued, pointing. "It's coming from the motor. And this wiring harness is acting like a radiator, funneling it directly into the sensor. You're not measuring the processor's heat. You're measuring the engine's." He looked at the senior engineer. "If you reroute those wires, give them some space to breathe, the problem will disappear." The lab was silent. The senior engineer stared at the drone, then back at Kellen, his mouth slightly agape. It was so simple, so obvious, that they had all missed it while searching for a complex software solution. Thea's lips curved into a slow, satisfied smile. That evening, Kellen walked into his apartment and dropped his new satchel by the door. He felt a type of exhaustion he hadn't felt in years. Not the physical ache of a double shift, but the deep, satisfying tiredness of a mind put to work. "How is your new office, Dad?" Wren asked from the living room floor, where she was doing her homework. He looked around his small, familiar apartment, then thought of the view from the 45th floor. It was good, he said, the word feeling real for the first time. It was really good. Later that night, long after Wren was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table. He pushed aside the stack of overdue bills and took out a brand new, empty notebook he had bought on his way home. He opened it to the first blank page. He picked up a pencil, and under the quiet hum of the refrigerator, Kellen Grayson, the inventor, began to draw. The weeks that followed were a quiet revolution. The Sparrow drone, its wires rerouted as Kellen had suggested, flew flawlessly. The overheating problem vanished. The engineering team, after a period of collective, stunned silence, began to treat him differently. The initial skepticism was replaced by a grudging respect, which slowly blossomed into genuine curiosity. They learned that Kellen had a name for the phenomenon he'd spotted. He called it thermal channeling. It wasn't a term from any textbook. It was his own. He started attending project meetings, initially just listening from the back of the room. But when a discussion about a new automated lift system got bogged down in arguments over hydraulic pressure versus magnetic levitation, Kellen would quietly sketch something on a notepad, slide it across the table and ask, "Have you thought about a counterweight system using the building's own gravitational energy?" He didn't just solve problems, he reframed them. Thea watched it all from a distance. She saw the way the other engineers would now pause before finalizing a design, glancing toward Kellen's workstation to see if he would nod or frown. He never gloated. He never once said, "I told you so." He just shared his insights with a quiet humility that was more powerful than any boast. Their own interactions changed, too. They were no longer the CEO and the janitor, or the benefactor and the project. They were colleagues. He would bring his notebooks to her office, and they would sit for hours, not as boss and employee, but as two inventors geeking out over a shared passion. She would talk about market scalability and patent law. He would talk about gear ratios and stress tolerances. She was teaching him her world, and he was reminding her of the nuts and bolts that held it together. One afternoon, as they were wrapping up a meeting, she hesitated at the door. "My company is hosting its annual family day at the Botanical Gardens this Saturday," she said, the words sounding slightly formal, as if she were testing their weight. "It's for all employees and their children. I know it's short notice, but I was hoping you and Wren would come." Kellen was surprised. He'd seen the flyers for the event, a lavish affair with catered food, pony rides, and live music. It was a day for the corporate elite to relax with their families. "Oh, I don't know," he started. "That seems more for the executive level." "You're on my executive R&D team now, Kellen," she countered gently. "Besides, I've heard a certain 10-year-old is an expert on botanical illustration. I might need a consultant." Her smile was genuine, and it disarmed him completely. "Okay," he said, a slow grin spreading across his face. "We'll be there." The Botanical Gardens on Saturday were a sea of polo shirts and sundresses. The air was filled with the sounds of polite laughter and the clinking of glasses. Kellen felt the familiar sense of being an imposter creep back in as he saw the other families, the men in their expensive casual wear, the women with their perfectly styled hair, their children in matching outfits. He and Wren, in their simple jeans and t-shirts, felt like they had wandered into the wrong party. "Wow," Wren whispered, her eyes wide as she took in the massive, bouncy castle shaped like a dragon. "This is fancier than the state fair." Before Kellen could feel too out of place, Thea appeared at their side. She had traded her power suit for a simple linen dress, and her hair was down, falling softly around her shoulders. She looked relaxed, younger. "I'm so glad you came," she said, her eyes lighting up when she saw Ren. "Ren, I have a very important mission for you. The pastry chef has created a new dessert, but he needs a professional opinion. Are you up for the task?" Ren gasped. "A professional?" "The highest," Thea said with a mock-serious expression. Ren saluted and darted off toward the dessert table, leaving Kellen and Thea standing together. "Thank you for that," he said. She was feeling a little intimidated. "So was I," Thea admitted quietly, surprising him. "I'm not good at this." The small talk, the pretending to be relaxed. She looked around at the crowd. "I feel more at home in a boardroom." It was the most vulnerable thing he had ever heard her say. "Well," he said softly, "for what it's worth, I think you're doing great." They spent the next hour walking through the gardens, Ren occasionally running back to them to deliver solemn reports on the quality of the miniature cheesecakes. They were talking near the rose garden when a man from the marketing department approached with his wife. "Kellen, good to see you moving up in the world," the man said with a little too much cheer. His wife looked Kellen up and down, her smile thin and painted on. "Kellen Grayson," she said, recognition dawning in her eyes. "Of course, you're the janitor from the video. My husband told me all about your sudden promotion. It's just amazing what a little good press can do for a career these days, isn't it?" The comment hung in the air, dripping with condescension. Kellen felt his face flush. The familiar shame, the feeling of being judged by his past, tightened in his chest. He didn't have to say a word. Thea stepped forward slightly, her relaxed demeanor vanishing, replaced by a cool, quiet authority. "You're mistaken, Cynthia," Thea said, her voice pleasant but edged with steel. "The press didn't get Kellen his job. His talent did. The Sparrow drone your husband's department is about to build a multi-million-dollar campaign around? It flies because of Kellen. His results are the reason your husband is getting his quarterly bonus." She smiled, the same thin, painted-on smile the woman had given Kellen. "It's just amazing what actual competence can do for a company, isn't it?" The woman's face went pale, then red. She stammered an apology and quickly dragged her husband away. Kellen looked at Thea, his throat tight with emotion. She had defended him. Not as a boss defending an employee, but as a friend. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "Yes," she replied, her eyes meeting his. "I did." They stood in silence for a moment, the sound of the party fading into the background. The line between the 45th floor and the front stoop in his neighborhood had just dissolved completely. Later, as the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the gardens, they found Ren sitting on a bench with her sketchbook, deeply focused. Thea sat down beside her. "What are you drawing?" she asked softly. Ren showed her the page. It was a sketch of the rose garden, but in the middle of it, she had drawn two figures standing side by side, talking. Her dad and Thea. "My dad says some things are messy before they get fixed," Ren said, not looking up from her drawing. "I think you were messy." Thea blinked, taken aback. "Was I?" Ren finally looked up, her gaze direct and profoundly serious. "You were lonely," she said. "Are you fixed now?" Thea stared at the little girl, then at Kellen, who was watching them with a gentle smile. She felt something in her chest unlock, a feeling she hadn't realized was there. "I'm getting there," Thea said, her voice barely a whisper. "I think I'm getting there." The weeks after the family day melted into a comfortable new rhythm. Kellen's workstation in the R&D lab became a hub of activity. Engineers who had once dismissed him now brought him their toughest problems, not with schematics, but with the physical components, waiting for him to turn the object over in his hands and find the simple truth they had missed. He and Ren began having dinner with Thea once a week. Sometimes they would order pizza to her vast, sterile penthouse, and Ren would fill the silent, echoing space with laughter. leaving crayon drawings on the marble countertops. Other times, Thea would come to their small apartment, sitting at their wobbly kitchen table, perfectly at ease, as Kellen cooked. She was different now. The icy armor was gone, replaced by a warmth that seemed to surprise even her. She would listen, truly listen, as Wren chattered about school, or as Kellen explained a new idea. He learned about the woman behind the CEO, the lonely childhood, the immense pressure from her father to be perfect, the deep love she'd had for her late husband, a man she described as a brilliant inventor, much like Kellen himself. Their worlds hadn't just collided, they had merged. For the first time in a long time, all three of them felt like they were part of a family. The peace felt so real, so earned, that none of them saw the storm gathering on the horizon. It started with a single, unsigned email that appeared in Thea's private inbox. The subject line was one word: Echo. The body of the email contained only a link to a news article profiling Caldwell Logistics' recent successes, with a specific mention of its new star inventor, Kellen Grayson. Thea felt a cold dread snake its way up her spine. Echo was the name of her husband's final project, the one that had been stolen. Only one other person on Earth knew that name: Cassian Reed, her husband's former business partner, the man who had betrayed him, stolen his work, and built an empire upon his grave. She deleted the email, her hand trembling slightly. She told herself it was a coincidence, a ghost. But a week later, there was a security breach in the R&D lab. Nothing was taken, no data was copied, but the logs showed that someone had accessed the primary files for Kellen's newest project, a revolutionary gyroscopic navigation system for drones, based on one of his old notebook sketches. It was a project that promised to make all current GPS-based systems obsolete. Thea's armor began to creep back into place. She became guarded, her laughter less frequent, the old tension returning to her shoulders. Kellen noticed it immediately. The easy camaraderie in their meetings was replaced by a strained formality. She would look at him with a worry in her eyes that he didn't understand. "Is everything okay?" he asked her one afternoon, after she'd shot down one of his ideas with uncharacteristic sharpness. "Everything is fine," she'd replied, her voice clipped. "Just some market pressures, nothing to concern yourself with." He knew she was lying. The threat escalated a few days later. Kellen came home from work to find his apartment door slightly ajar. His heart leaped into his throat as he burst inside, calling Wren's name. She was fine, safe at her after-school program. He checked the apartment. The TV was still there, the laptops, the cash he kept in a coffee jar. Nothing of value had been taken. He was about to call the police when he noticed it. The new notebook, the one he'd been filling with his work for Caldwell Logistics, was gone from the kitchen table. In its place was a single, perfect black feather. It was Cassian Reed's calling card, a symbol he used in his own company's branding. It was a message. That night, Kellen drove to Thea's penthouse. He bypassed the front desk and took the private elevator, his mind racing. When she opened the door, she saw the look on his face and the black feather in his hand, and her carefully constructed walls crumbled. "He knows," Kellen said, his voice low and dangerous. "Who is he, Thea? And what does he want with me?" She led him inside, her face pale. She finally told him everything. About her late husband, Liam, another gentle genius. About his partner, Cassian Reed, a man with limitless ambition and no conscience. She told him how Cassian had forced Liam out of their company, stealing the patent for his Echo project, a revolutionary engine design. 6 months later, Liam was dead from what the police ruled a heart attack, and Cassian's company, built on that stolen engine, had become a global powerhouse. "I've been fighting him for years," she said, her voice choked with grief and rage. "In the courts, in the press, but he's always a step ahead. He's untouchable." She looked at the feather in Kellen's hand. "Now he's heard about you. He must see your work, your talent, as a threat to the lie he's built his life on. He thinks you're the new Liam. Kellen stared at her, the pieces finally clicking into place. Thea's guardedness, the security breach, the stolen notebook. It wasn't just a job anymore. He and Ren had stumbled into the middle of a war they didn't know existed. Thea's past hadn't just caught up with her, it had reached out and wrapped its hands around his future. "He's not just trying to steal your ideas, Kellen," Thea whispered, tears finally tracing paths down her cheeks. "He's trying to erase you, to get to me." Kellen looked from her terrified, tear-streaked face to the feather in his hand. He thought of his daughter, sleeping safely in her bed, blissfully unaware of the predator that was now circling their lives. The fear he felt was cold and sharp, but beneath it, something else was kindling. A resolve. A fire she had ignited in him on the side of a burning freeway. "You fight for whatever comes next." He closed his hand, crushing the feather in his fist. "No," he said, his voice steady and clear. "He's not going to get to either of us." The safe, quiet world Kellen had built for Ren shattered that night. The black feather wasn't just a threat. It was an infection, spreading fear through the small, happy spaces of their life. For 2 days, they operated in a state of high alert. Kellen would walk Ren to the school bus and watch until it turned the corner. Thea hired a discreet security detail to shadow them, plain cars driven by men with watchful eyes. The ease between them was gone, replaced by the grim solidarity of soldiers in a trench. They were in Thea's office, the city lights glittering below like a silent, indifferent galaxy. The stolen notebook was the central topic. "He's gauging the threat," Kellen said, pacing the length of the vast room. "He didn't steal it to copy the designs. He stole it to see what I was capable of, how fast I was moving." "So he knows about the gyroscopic navigator," Thea said, her voice tight. "He knows it would make his company's entire drone fleet obsolete." "Exactly. And a man like that won't compete in the marketplace," Kellen reasoned, his mind, usually focused on mechanics, now working through the mechanics of a predator. He'll burn the marketplace down. He's going to try to destroy the project before it ever sees the light of day. A plan began to form in his eyes, a flicker of the same intuition that saw the flaws in machines. "So we let him." Thea looked up, her brow furrowed. "Let him?" "We give him a target," Kellen said, his voice gaining strength. "A big, public, irresistible target. We announce the official unveiling of the GN1 system. We book a major venue, send out press releases, invite the entire industry. We make it look like we're rushing to market, that we're confident, maybe even a little arrogant." Thea's eyes widened as she understood. "You're baiting a trap. A man that arrogant can't resist a public execution," Kellen finished. "He won't just want to stop us. He'll want to humiliate us. He'll send someone to sabotage the event. And when he does, we'll be waiting for him." The next 2 weeks were a blur of calculated deception. Thea's PR team launched a massive campaign for the unveiling of the revolutionary Caldwell GN1. They booked the main hall at the city's largest tech conference. Invitations went out to every major player in the industry, with a special, hand-delivered invitation sent to Cassian Reed. Kellen, meanwhile, worked feverishly in the lab, not on the navigation system, but on his real project. Ren was sent to stay with a cousin upstate, a decision that tore at Kellen's heart but was grimly necessary. This was a war, and he had to get his daughter off the battlefield. The night of the unveiling arrived. The hall was electric, packed with journalists, investors, and rivals. Cassian Reed was seated in the front row, looking smug and relaxed, a predator watching the prey walk onto the stage. Thea stepped into the spotlight, the picture of cool confidence. "For decades, drone navigation has been dependent on external signals," she began, her voice resonating through the hall. "It has been limited by weather, by urban canyons, by the simple fact that it must always look outside itself for direction. Tonight, that changes." As she spoke, Kellen was backstage, making the final adjustments to a fleet of a dozen small black drones. They were modified Sparrow drones, but their purpose tonight wasn't delivery. It was defense. On stage, Thea continued, "We are proud to present the future, the Caldwell GN1. On cue, a single, large drone was supposed to rise from a platform on the stage. Instead, the lights in the entire hall flickered violently and then died, plunging the room into absolute darkness. A collective gasp went through the audience, followed by nervous murmurs. Cassian Reed smiled in the dark, but the darkness lasted only a second. Suddenly, a dozen points of red light pierced the blackness from above. Kellen's drone fleet, running on an independent backup system he'd installed, activated silently. They swarmed into the air, their low-light cameras feeding directly to the main screen. The screen flickered back to life, not with Thea's presentation, but with a crystal-clear image of a man in the high rafters, a pair of industrial wire cutters in his hand, caught mid-snip on a master power cable. He was frozen in the crosshairs of a dozen laser-targeting dots. The audience gasped. "It seems we have a technical difficulty," Thea said calmly into the mic, as security swarmed the saboteur. Cassian's smile had vanished, but the trap was just closing. "However," Thea continued, her voice turning to ice as she stared directly at Cassian, "the GN1 was never the real story tonight. The real presentation is about a different kind of inventor." An image appeared on the screen behind her. It was a photograph of a young, smiling man with kind eyes, her late husband, Liam. "This was Liam Caldwell," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "and he was the true architect of the modern drone industry." She brought up Liam's original dated design documents for his Echo engine. Then, she displayed the internal schematics for Cassian Reed's best-selling engine. They were identical, down to the last bolt. "Mr. Reed has built an empire on a lie," Thea declared, her voice ringing with the power of long-suppressed truth. "But a lie is just a machine with a fatal flaw, and my team is very, very good at finding flaws." She took a breath. "When Mr. Reed's agents stole Kellen Grayson's notebook, they thought they were stealing his ideas. In fact, they were delivering a Trojan horse. The notebook contained a decoy design for our navigation system, embedded with a diagnostic key. We knew Mr. Reed's team would be arrogant enough to try and hack our servers to verify the decoy designs. When they did, our key activated. It didn't steal from them. It simply searched for a ghost." On the screen, a file appeared. A single encrypted project file from deep within Cassian Reed's private servers. The file name was Echo, and the creation date was from 8 years ago, proving he had possessed Liam's work long before he claimed to have invented it himself. It was over. The proof was absolute, undeniable, broadcast to the entire world. Cassian Reed sat frozen in his chair, his face a mask of disbelief as police officers began moving toward his row. The ghost he had buried had returned and was now burying him. 3 months later, the 45th floor was quiet. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and violet. Thea, Kellen, and Wren stood by the large window, looking out at the city. The peace was no longer a temporary ceasefire. It was a permanent state of being. Cassian Reed was facing a mountain of federal charges, his company collapsing under the weight of the scandal. Thea had finally won justice for Liam. She had renamed the R&D department. A new silver plaque by the entrance read, "The Caldwell and Grayson Innovation Center." "It has a nice ring to it," Kellen said, sipping his coffee. Thea smiled, a real easy smile that reached her eyes. "It does. Liam would have liked you." Wren, sitting on the floor, held up her sketchbook. She had drawn the three of them, not as stick figures, but with surprising detail, standing together by the window. Underneath, she had written, "The Fixers." Kellen knelt down and hugged her. He looked at Thea over his daughter's head, his heart full. He had lost a job interview and found a life. He had faced down a monster and found his own strength. "What are you thinking about?" Thea asked softly. Kellen pulled out his own notebook, the new one, and flipped to a blank page. He sketched a few quick lines: a house with a small yard, a workshop out back, a swing set. "I'm thinking about what comes next," he said, looking at her, his eyes full of a future he was no longer afraid to invent. And together they watched the city lights blink on, one by one, like a galaxy of brand new stars. Okay, let's all just take a breath after that one. It's amazing how a story can completely change the feeling in a room, isn't it? It has a weight and a life of its own. Here's a thought. If this story made you think of someone, what's one single word you would use to describe its core message to them? I'd love to see the words that show up in the comments. You know, every like and subscribe acts like a ripple. It starts with you, and it spreads outward, carrying the feeling of this story to people we'll never even meet. You become part of that ripple. Thank you for being the one to start the wave, for listening, and for being here. Now go out there and make some good ripples of your own.